Well, here we are, folks. It is same-sex marriage day. We have the big vote today in Parliament. And you know, all of this is because of that behind me. That's the Supreme Court of Canada. And of course, the danger for many parliamentarians was that, you know, not letting gay and lesbian people marry would somehow be an infringement of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the guys back there would enforce that law anyway. So that has a lot to do with where we're at today. Now, we are going into the House of Commons. We are going to have this historic vote. The odds are, of course, that MPs will vote overwhelmingly not to overturn the definition of marriage that was brought in 2 years ago and to restore the traditional definition of marriage. Now, the vote today is just on a motion of the government's intent to bring in legislation to restore traditional marriage. But if this motion goes nowhere, kaput, it's finished. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. But man, it's going to be a very interesting vote. And let's go in the House right now and see what happens. Well, we're just about to watch the vote right now. We've done a quick tape. We're going to do an instant replay. And let's just take a look at some of the highlights here, some of the things we should watch for. Here we go. Mr. Harper, obviously, is the first to vote. Now we're seeing the cabinet members line up. You'll see here that most of the front bench is standing. We have, wait a minute now. Mr. McKay is not standing. Mr. Prentice is not standing. Mr. Cannon is not stood. There's Mr. Emerson. You can see him as well. He is sitting there resolutely. All of the front bench otherwise is standing, right down to Mr. Fletcher, who nods his agreement. Now, second row. Oh, we see Mr. Richardson, Mr. Casey have not stood. Everybody else now is up. There's John Baird, Treasurer Board. He is not standing, and he is being applauded by the opposition for not standing. Madame Bernier, also not standing, gets a bit of applause. We go through the rest of the cabinet. There's Peter Van Loan, the last cabinet position to be recording his vote. Now we get down the rest of the second bench. Oh, you can see Mr. Mike Chong, a former Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, looking very sullen. He also is not standing. And now we're at the end of the third row of Conservatives. Moving now into the back benches, we anticipate pretty well a full participation on the part of these members. Here we go, no surprises. A little bit of attitude from that member. We go on. Now we're into the parliamentary secretaries. Yeah, they're all there. Pierre Poilievre, Mr. Carey, away we go. There's Jason Kenney, parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. Yeah, they're all there to a person now in support of this government position to restore traditional marriage, or at least to bring in a vote to get that process started. There's Mr. Keddy from Nova Scotia. He is not standing, as expected, one of the backbenchers who has consistently supported same-sex marriage. And now we move into the back row of the Conservatives. Don't expect any surprises here. Actually, we're in the fourth row of the backbench. And yeah, no, they're all there. No surprises. We're going through all these members now. It looks like the Conservatives are fairly united in this particular vote. There's Mr. Jaffer, the National Caucus Chair, Gord Brown, the Ontario Caucus Chair. Now we're coming into some of the members from southwestern Ontario, the so-called Bible Belt, and they're all standing to support this motion.
Mr. Preston, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Tilson, Mr. Trost, Mr. Tweed, Mr. Watson,
Yeah, that's the end of this row, and now we move into the final row of Conservatives here. These are pretty well all members who were elected for the first time in January, which of course is why they're on the back. And looks like they're all supporting it. I thought Laurie Arron there would pull a fast one, but no, he's lined up with the other guys. Everyone else, there's Ken Epp. Let's see who else. We've got one member down there. I don't quite see who it is, but one member has declined to vote. And the rest, and we're going to end up with, there we go, the last of the Conservatives standing pretty well en masse to support the government motion. That's it. Those are the Conservatives. Oh, we got a few more on the other side now, and a few Liberals are now standing. Let's see if there are any surprises here. No, not really. We're hearing applause now from the Conservatives. They're actually giving a big round of applause to those people who are supporting the government motion. Jim Carey-Janis. Mr. Lee, yes, indeed. A few others. There's John McKay standing. Tom Wappel, a long-time anti-abortion crusader. Yes, there are a few others. Not too many. Looks like 14 or 15 Liberals now are standing. There's Mr. McKay, who threatened a bit of a caucus revolt. John McKay, unless there was a free vote on the part of the Liberals, which they did ultimately give into just yesterday morning. Alan Tonks, former chair in the Metropolitan Toronto, has voted in favour.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
There you go. That's it. That's everyone who's in favour of this motion. Now, who are opposed? Should be Mr. Dion starting here, and it is Stéphane Dion, who leads off the supporters of gay marriage who are opposing this motion. And now we're moving through the Liberal front bench. There should be no surprises here as we go forward and see all of the remaining Liberals who are lining up, who are opposing the government's motion to bring in a review of same-sex marriage and a restoration of the traditional definition of marriage.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Godfrey.
Mr. Godfrey.
Ms. Mina.
Ms. Mina.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Belanger.
Mr. Belanger.
Mr. Chan.
Mr. Chan.
Mr. Coder.
Mr. Coder.
Mr. Kotler.
Mr. Kotler.
Madame Jennings.
Madame Jennings.
Mrs. Redmond.
Mrs. Redmond.
Mr. Savage. Mr. Simard.
Mr. Simard.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. Owen.
Mr. Owen.
Mr. Thibault Westnova.
Mr. Thibault Westnova.
Mr. Dosange.
Mr. Dosange.
Ms. Stronach.
Ms. Stronach.
Ms. Beaumier.
Ms. Beaumier.
Mrs. Chamberlain.
Mrs. Chamberlain.
Ms. Brown Oakville.
Ms. Brown Oakville.
Mr. Martin Esquema-Wandafuca.
Well, we're not really seeing any surprises here. Pretty well all of the 102 Liberals, with the exception, I think, of around 14 or 15, are voting all together, and they are voting against the government motion to look into restoring traditional definition of marriage. This is pretty well what we expected right now. It looks at this moment, of course, that all the Bloc and all the NDP will be supporting this this particular stand, and that would make this vote, I would suspect, just over 170 votes are going to be opposing the government's motion, and the government's motion will be defeated. We're just running through now the remainder of the Liberal members, getting down to, hey, there's me sitting in the back row. You can see where I am. And actually beside me is the newly elected Liberal Member of Parliament from London North Centre, elected in the by-election just a few days ago, who took a seat just before question period today. You'll see him vote in a moment in his seat beside me. And as he does, he gets a big round of applause from his newly minted colleagues in the House of Commons. And there he is, right there. You'll hear the applause as I blog away. Now we're going to the Bloc. Monsieur Duceppe, followed by Mr. Paquette, Mr. Gauthier, and the rest of the front bench.
Monsieur Menard Hochelaga.
Monsieur Menard Hochelaga.
Monsieur Crête.
Monsieur Crête.
Monsieur Bachand.
Monsieur Bachand.
Monsieur Laframboise.
Monsieur Laframboise.
Madame Picard.
Madame Picard.
Monsieur Guimont.
Monsieur Guimont.
Madame Gay.
Madame Gay.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Madame Brunel.
Madame Brunel.
Madame Saint-Hilaire.
Madame Saint-Hilaire.
Monsieur Roy.
Monsieur Roy.
Monsieur Bigras.
Monsieur Bigras.
Madame Demers.
Madame Demers.
Monsieur Lessard.
Monsieur Lessard.
Monsieur Menard Marcorel-Fortin.
Monsieur Menard Marcorel-Fortin.
Madame Faye.
Madame Faye.
Madame Barbeau.
Madame Barbeau.
Monsieur Coteau.
Monsieur Coteau.
Well, we've had one block member who has abstained from this vote. All the rest appear to be voting absolutely together against the government motion, but one block member has now abstained.
Madame Deschamps.
Madame Deschamps.
Monsieur Bouchard.
Monsieur Bouchard.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Blais.
Monsieur Blais.
Monsieur Asselin.
Monsieur Asselin.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Perron.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Monsieur Laforêt.
Madame Morani.
Madame Morani.
Monsieur Lucier.
Monsieur Lucier.
Monsieur Malot.
Monsieur Malot.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Carrier.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Lévesque.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Saint-Cyr.
Monsieur Ouellet.
Monsieur Ouellet.
Monsieur André.
Monsieur André.
Monsieur Vincent.
Monsieur Vincent.
Madame Freeman.
Madame Freeman.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Monsieur Nadeau.
Well, now we move over to the NDP, and Jack Layton, Alexa McDonough are leading the vote there, and I suspect there will be absolute unanimity here. The NDP definitely have been supporters vocally and long-time supporters of same-sex rights.
Mr. Comartin.
Ms. Black.
Ms. Black.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Christopherson.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Cullen, Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Cullen, Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Ms. Crowder.
Ms. Crowder.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Sixsay.
Mr. Sixsay.
Ms. Pretty.
Ms. Pretty.
Mrs. Matheson.
Mrs. Matheson.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Mr. Adamanenko.
Ms. Bell, Vancouver Island North.
Ms. Bell, Vancouver Island North.
Mr. Bevington.
Mr. Bevington.
Ms. Charlton.
Ms. Charlton.
Ms. Chow.
Ms. Chow.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Marston.
Mr. Marston.
Ms. Nash.
Ms. Nash.
Mr. Stauffer.
Mr. Stauffer.
Madame Savoy.
Well, this completes the NDP. The Speaker will now go over to the other side. There's Bill Blakey, Deputy Speaker. And now the Tories who are opposing their own motion.
Mr. McKay, Central Nova.
There's Peter MacKay, Foreign Minister, Jim Prentice,
Cannon Pontiac.
Mr. Cannon, Lawrence Cannon,
Emerson.
and David Emerson. They're the front bench
Mr. Casey.
objectors to the government's motion. Bill Casey, Nova Scotia, Lee Richardson from Calgary, John Baird, President of the Treasury Board. And yeah, there's Michael Chung, former Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. Behind him, Gerald Keddy from Nova Scotia.
Mr. Keddy, South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Mr. Keddy, South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Mr. Manning.
Mr. Manning.
That's it.
Turner.
Oh,
Mr. Turner.
and that's it. I voted. You didn't even see me. Well, there I go. Well, that's how important my vote was, tell you that. Anyway, we have now completed voting. And just to recap the results here, the clerk is about to read them. Here she is.
123, nays contre 175, 175.
Well, that's it. That's the end of it. We are done with that vote. And, of course, it's been an historic day. Many people hope that that is absolutely the end of the same-sex marriage debate. We don't know if that's the case, because there is the sentiment that if the Stephen Harper Conservatives do win a majority coming up in the next election, that this issue may raise its ugly head again. But let's hope that's it. Anyway, thanks for watching this coverage of MPtv. There's more to come. Hang on. Well, there you go. Now you know what the result was from the vote in the House of Commons. An historic day when a lot of members of Parliament had a free vote, and they're not normally accustomed to that. So a whole new experience for everybody. I'm joined now by Laurie Arron. He's National Coordinator for Canadians for Equal Marriage. And man, you must be relieved.
Well, you know, I think we all knew that Parliament was poised to defeat this motion. It was quite clear beforehand. And you know, this is actually the third vote in 3 years, in 3 different parliaments, under 3 different prime ministers, all to affirm the equal right of same-sex couples to civil marriage. So it's quite a historic day in one sense, bit of a bittersweet day because of course we've had to endure this basically attack for the last year and have this hanging over our heads. So it's good that it's finally settled. Okay, well that brings me to our second question. Is it finally settled? I mean, there are people who keep saying, you know, once Stephen Harper gets his majority government, if that happens, then man, this is right back on the agenda. And there are people who say this motion that we voted on today was a little disingenuous. It didn't actually answer the question. What's your view? Well, Stephen Harper said during the election that if this motion was defeated, the matter would be closed. So certainly, in our view, this matter is closed, and we hope that Stephen Harper lives up to his word and that the issue is closed as far as he's concerned and taken off the political agenda, and that Parliament will not be discussing this in the future. So settled as far as Parliament's concerned. You know, as far as people like Dr. McVitie and Defend Marriage and those sorts of folks, you know, it's never going to be settled for them, and that's fine. They have their right to express their beliefs, but I think as far as Parliament's concerned, it will be settled.
Some people fear that the Righteous Right has a bit of a pipeline into the Conservative government. Does that bother you, and do you think that exists?
Well, clearly it exists. I mean, we know that, you know, Dr. McVitie has said, I believe to you, that he has a pipeline.
He said lots of things to me.
Yeah, and it's quite clear when we saw things like the Defence of Religions Act being floated that, that obviously the religious right has a really, they are the political base of Stephen Harper, and you know, certainly that's a concern. I think it's a concern for all Canadians that issues like minority rights, women's rights, the environment, I mean, all sorts of issues that that Canadians feel strongly about, and you know, the whole idea of an inclusive Canada where equality, where respect for difference are important to the government, you know, there's a big concern about that because of the influence of Mr. Harper's political base. Okay, last question. Do you think there's been any damage done to traditional marriage by allowing same-sex marriages to exist? Well, it's quite clear that allowing same-sex couples to marry has not changed what heterosexual marriage is. It hasn't changed anybody's marriages. It's still together in sickness and in health till death do you part. Really, there's been no impact on heterosexual marriage. I think, if anything, what this has done is made marriage a more inclusive institution, and certainly young people who are overwhelmingly in favor of equal marriage are the ones who are getting married, and I think this is likely to make it a more palatable institution for them because it is more inclusive.
Okay, Laurie Arron, thank you very much for joining us.